Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. In my last video, I talked about the first leg of a trip I took recently to Massachusetts. And at the end of that video, I was boarding a bus to take me from Amherst to Boston. Actually, during my time in New England, I spent 2 separate weekends in Boston. But for this video, I'm only going to talk about the second one. And at the end of the video, I'll do a little haul with all the used books I acquired at the Brattle on my visit there with Steve Donoghue. I'll try to break the video down with timestamps in the description box if you want to skip around. So let's get started. On this leg of my journey, I stayed downtown at the same place I've stayed for the last few visits to Boston, the College Club. I talked about this wonderful little spot in previous Boston videos. It's a centrally located bed and breakfast right near the public garden, which initially was a space for educated and professional women, an alternative to the all-male clubs common in the 19th century. Technically, the College Club is still a membership organization that hosts book groups and teas and the like, but it's also a small bed and breakfast with roughly a dozen bedrooms open to anyone who makes a reservation. The College Club is relatively affordable, at least for downtown Boston, and it's conveniently located with the public garden, as I said, just a few blocks away, and the Brattle bookshop just a few steps further. Then Newberry Street and the rest of the Back Bay is in the other direction. And the street the club is on is the wide Commonwealth Avenue, one divided road with basically a block-wide, beautiful park running the whole length of the avenue. The College Club is relatively affordable for me because they have several rooms specifically intended for single travelers, where 2 single guests share a bathroom down the hall. All the rooms are named after local colleges and are decorated with allusions to the colleges as well. This time I was in the Emerson room. As you may know, Ralph Waldo Emerson's home was on my itinerary for this trip, but my room was named after Emerson College, a school that I walked past on my way to the Brattle bookshop. Emerson College is famous for its theater program, and so the decorations for this room included framed playbills, etc. on the walls, including this playbill with an illustration made by the incomparable artist Al Hirschfeld, who hid his daughter's name, Nina, in all his sketches. My father and I loved to search for them together back when I was a little girl. Can you find the Nina here? Well, it was great to be in downtown Boston, and I enjoyed my first afternoon by walking down Commonwealth Avenue all the way to a couple of comic stores, and also to Trident Books, a Boston area bookshop that I visited often back in the late 1980s when I lived in the area for a few years. I love Trident and its large collection of all sorts of books. It isn't as stocked with University Press books as you might find in the bookstores around Harbor Square, which I'll talk about in an upcoming video, but it carries a wide selection of books, including both works of history and a big diversity of beautiful editions of classics, meaning 19th and 20th century classics, not Greek and Roman texts, although those are on the shelves too. I went in late on a Friday afternoon, and unfortunately the store was jam-packed, so much so that it was hard to browse. I would have gone to Trident again the next morning, hoping for smaller crowds that early in the day, but I had other exciting plans. It was a drizzly morning, gray and threatening, but I first headed out for some early morning time in the public garden. The swan boats were all tied up in the center of the lake, and they stayed that way throughout the day, presumably because of the rain. I also visited the nearby statue of Edgar Allan Poe, with coat and papers flying in the wind, appropriate for the real-life weather. And then I arrived at the famed Brattle bookshop. Technically, despite the rain, the carts were outside, but they were all bundled together with tarps covering the mass in the center of the outdoor sale lot I love so much. Luckily, the permanent shelves running along the sides of the outdoor lot had been opened up, so I browsed for a few minutes before the special guest arrived. And just as Steve Donoghue made his appearance, the rain picked up a bit more. We spent a while inside, and I found so many books that intrigued me. But the cost, which was totally reasonable for a used bookstore, was quite a bit more than the books on the carts outside would have been. Instead of $1, $3, or $5, the books I pulled off the inside shelves were often as much as $8 or $15. And I was intending to ship them home, so I wouldn't have to carry them with me on the train. So that was a little bit more expense. So I was more selective than usual. I picked up 5 books, a combination of inside and sale lot books. I'll show you those books at the end of the video. I spent more time inside the Brattle than I ever had before, and the selection there is, not surprisingly, astounding. It was also great fun to eavesdrop on other customers, seeing what they were picking up and hearing what they were saying to their shopping companions. And near the end of my time there, I half joined Steve and another shopper standing around the table near the entrance where books new to the store get sorted and priced. There were some beauties there, and listening to Steve chat with the other reader was really fascinating. Then, after we wrapped up our shopping and checked out, Steve and I walked across the common to what he referred to as one of his favorite restaurants. He joked that he was worried that I might drag him to some delicate little restaurant where both the plates and the chairs would be too small for him. And we had a lovely meal at his spot and got to talk about both books and booktube. At some point during the day, he took a couple of pictures of us together, as well as a photo of me in my new hat, sent to me by an incredibly generous viewer. It makes me laugh every time I put it on to know that I have my own channel swag now. Thank you to the sender, whose identity I promised to keep private. By the time we walked out of the restaurant after a leisurely lunch, it was quite a bit sunnier. The State House dome was shining, and there seemed to be dogs walking everywhere. We chatted just a bit more and said our goodbyes. So, soon after I arrived home to the D.C. area at the end of my Massachusetts adventure, the box of books from the Brattle arrived on my doorstep. Let me go through it. A couple of themes ran through the choices, but the first book is not part of those themes. It is Charlton Ogborn's The Winter Beach. This is an account of the author's travels along the Atlantic coast, from the coast of northern Maine all the way down to the Outer Banks in North Carolina, fairly near where I grew up. Ogborn wrote this account back in the 1960s, I think, at a time when so many of the beaches along that Atlantic coast were small and still quite natural. That is, of course, far less true now. I've not read this book, but I've known about it since I was a little girl, since the author lived relatively near my family in coastal South Carolina. I don't remember ever meeting him, but I think my father might have known him a little. Anyway, the book has a few material interests, none of which I paid any attention to when I bought the book. First, the first page has this interesting signature, which I can't quite make out. But then within the book, there are 2 inserts. One is sort of a bookmark from a bookstore in Pittsburgh, North Carolina, one that I went to regularly when I lived just a few miles away right after college, and the store is still open. And then later is a flyer for a local village center near the bookstore with a list of all the charming cafes and shops, etc. My plan is to save this one to read when I head down to the South Carolina coast this winter to visit my brother and my sister-in-law, where my whole extended family has lived for generations. Seems perfect. The winter beach read at a winter beach. The next two books I'm going to talk about are about 19th century American literature. As an historian who has come to lean more towards literature, I can imagine I might have picked these books up on any visit to the Brattle. But this time, while I was having this explicitly historical literary adventure in New England, they seemed especially interesting to me. The title of the first is Truth's Ragged Edge, The Rise of the American Novel, written by Philip F. Gora. He looks deeply both at novels still widely read as well as authors who are now barely remembered, although a few of the writers he considers barely remembered are now, more than a dozen years after his book was published, quite widely read in classrooms. For example, he includes Harriet Jacobs and what he refers to as her autobiographical novel, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which is widely read in American history classes at least. Anyway, Gora's main theme is how what he calls the fundamental religiosity of American life shaped the early American novel. As he says, quote, "Our nation's pioneering novelists, it turned out, wrote less in the service of art than of morality." There's a blurb on the back cover from Robert Richardson, the author of the wonderful long biography of Ralph Waldo Emerson, which I was reading on my New England trip, and we'll talk about in a future video. He says that Truth's Ragged Edge is, quote, "the most ambitious, most comprehensive study ever attempted of American fiction from its beginnings to 1868, that will change the way you look at the American novel." There are a lot of big shot blurbs on the back of this book, and one of them points out that Gora's book is engaging with the central question of how early American novelists grappled with the, quote, "ideals and realities of democratic liberalism." That almost made me cry in the middle of the Brattle, and I wondered how today's political climate in the U.S. will affect American fiction, especially how scholars years from now around the globe will look back on those contemporary texts of our generation. Will they see evidence of liberal democracy? Gora, the author, is really interesting. He wrote the classic book American Transcendentalism, A History, back in the early years of the 21st century. And at the end of this year, he has a new book coming out, Reading with Transcendentalists, 10 works that made a movement. So Gora was already on my mind as I spent these weeks traveling through 19th century literary New England. But Gora also wrote a book about banjo music in the 19th century, and another one about Martin acoustic guitars. There was also an interesting insert in Gora's books, an old Amazon Marketplace receipt from 2013, a full-size printout with the name and address of the recipient, which I tried to cover up. I looked the purchaser up, and he's a scholar of a particular early 19th century American author who is now not read nearly as much as he used to be, James Fenimore Cooper. The initial cost of this particular book was $30 way back in 2013. But this scholar bought it used for roughly $2.50 later that same year. And I paid $15 for it, more than a decade later. Also inserted into the book is a folded page of notes, all crammed together in a tight script that reminds me tremendously of my father's handwriting. There's also a bit of underlining and pencil throughout the book, sometimes with annotations alongside. I don't always want to have someone else's thoughts pointed out in books I'm reading, but when they know far more than I do about a topic, I'm really looking forward to it. Okay, the next in this pair of two related books is one I found outside in the sale lot, called Reading Fiction in Antebellum America, Informed Response and Reception Histories, 1820 to 1865, by James L. Mocker. I must say that the subtitle of this book scares me off a bit, with its reference to literary theory in the subtitle, in which I'm relatively unversed. But the description on the cover flap is compelling. The book's mocker is talking about are primarily books that were published during the antebellum period, similar to the book I just discussed. But the topic here is more about how they were received by readers in the public sphere, in formal published reviews, but also in private, in letters and journals meant only for family and friends. What the author is interested in is the reading practices of an earlier generation, as well as how these books have been understood in different ways over the years. And just like the previous book, this copy is also underlined, a little more extensively this time, and has several folded pages full of tight handwritten notes, looking sort of like my father's sometimes illegible handwriting. Could this have been owned by the same person who owned the first book? Well, lo and behold, when I opened it at home, this volume also has an inserted shipping receipt with the author's name on it. And it was indeed the same name and address. But this was not an Amazon purchase, it was a review copy for choice, sort of a literary version of Kirkus or a library journal, but focusing on university press books, basically. I want to talk in a little more depth about the inserts here. Those handwritten notes from 2011 were written on the back of a humanities class handout with grading rubrics. The professor would have passed this out to students, and here is one line. This class, quote, is intended to be a reasonably easy course to pass, but a hard course in which to get an A. To get that A would require what he said was original, thoughtful, and high-quality productivity throughout the course. What follows is a long discussion of documenting sources and avoiding plagiarism. When I first started teaching as a teaching assistant in the early 1990s, plagiarism was not a huge concern in our classes yet. Certainly, some students copied the work of other students from previous years. More often, they copied from books in the library, although this style of plagiarism, especially from freshmen, sometimes came from a misunderstanding of citation practices rather than a desire to cheat. But only a few years later, with the development of a much wider and more easily searchable internet, plagiarism became an enormous deal in colleges and universities, and this document clearly came from that era. And professors often ran student papers through plagiarism checkers to see if passages matched what was in those online databases. Back in the day, that felt tremendously complicated compared to the innocence of my own pre-internet college days. And of course, now this document about grading rubrics and plagiarism prevention seems quite innocent compared to what professors and high school teachers are dealing with in the world of AI. Actually, I have a little more to say about AI in the academic world, which I'll try to get to in some future video. Another one of the inserts into this book is the printed guidelines from Choice, the reviewing site, who asked its reviewers to submit their reviews either electronically or by post. And if they submitted to the website, no formatting would be preserved. So any diacritical marks had to be inserted by the author with special codes. Different world, and one that I remember only now that I see this direction. The last insert is, as you may have already guessed, a draft of the author's long review, printed out and gone over by the reviewer with a blue pen. I'm always intrigued to see how people edit their own work, what kinds of mistakes they make in a first draft, especially if they recur several times within just a few pages, even if they immediately catch them when they're reviewing their own manuscripts. But also what new ideas seem to emerge after we write first drafts. So it was really fun to read this preliminary review. Finding these two books that had definitely belonged to the same person made me think about how often the Brattle has a whole set of related books come in when they're returning from a buy. Some academic obsessed with a relatively esoteric topic might sell a bunch of books to the Brattle when the professor retires from a university and therefore loses a lot of shelf space, for example. I see those threads wind through the carts and the inside shelves whenever I get the chance to visit the Brattle. But I also see it when Steve posts his Instagram pictures or YouTube videos from his own weekly Brattle hauls. You can never predict what the particular topic strands will be on any given day. But what won't be a surprise is that there will be at least one or two different threads each time. Okay, the last two books I purchased at the Brattle are both collections of related short pieces written by famous biographers. The first that I'll mention is Golden Codger's Biographical Speculations, written by Richard Ellman, who is probably best known for his biography of James Joyce. In fact, he's so well known for that work that a current scholar, Zachary Leader, has written a study he calls Ellman's Joyce, the biography of a masterpiece and its master, or something like that. But the book I picked up at the Brattle is a collection of essays about a range of authors, from George Eliot to T.S. Eliot, as the cover flap cleverly summarizes. Ellman reads the author's works, looking at their first drafts and revisions when he can, as well as letters and journals, etc. He's interested not specifically in the lives of the authors, but instead in how the authors' lives are braided together with their written work. So this sounds really amazing. The next is by Leon Edel, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Henry James. But the book I picked up is Bloomsbury, A House of Lions. I love the copy on the back cover. In Bloomsbury, Leon Edel once told himself lightheartedly, there are 9 characters in search of an author. Those characters are Virginia Woolf, her husband Leonard Woolf, her sister Vanessa Bell, and others who were in their group, from Roger Fry to Duncan Grant, Clive Bell, Maynard Keynes, etc. And the author that they found, or rather that found them, was Leon Edel. He's interested in psychological interpretations of his, quote, characters, writing that analysis as if it were a novel without violating the facts. Or so says the back cover of this volume, published by Bloomsbury's own creation, Hogarth Press. I think I might have picked up this book anyway, but it had a special resonance right now. On my New England trip, I was thinking a lot about Bloomsbury, partly because of the brilliant title of a very bad book, American Bloomsbury by Susan Cheever, about the many literary residents of Concord, Massachusetts, Alcott, Thoreau, Emerson, Hawthorne, etc. And Concord is next up on my Massachusetts adventures, coming up soon here on Hannah's Books. Thanks for joining me today. See you soon.